That's the trick of having a phone. Happy days. My name's Nigel Stace, and I'm here to welcome you all to this webinar. Oh, jeez. I just want to check if the webinar is here. Welcome you to the Oceans of Power, this wind seminar, and got it. Happy day, and thank you very much for being here, and also on the web, on the webinar. And I will begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which we meet today, and I'd also like to pay respects to elders past and present. So, and also a great thanks to CSIRO for this wonderful venue and the web resources. So I'd now like to hand over to Luke, who will give us a induction to the venue.
Great, thanks Nigel. So just a quick one on facilities. If you haven't already used them, just out in the foyer to the left, the gents and ladies. In case of an emergency, we have a two-tone alert system. The first tone is just a warning. It's the beep beep. If you hear that, just be prepared to evacuate. Something's been investigated. If it does escalate to an evacuation, the tone changes to the whoop whoop. That's the signal we have to leave. In a calm manner, we exit through this door here. The evacuation point's just on the grassed area next to the car park. So 50-metre walk, we're pretty much right there. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Luke. So we've done the induction. So just a brief introduction about the Australian Institute of Energy. We're a non-profit professional institution, and here's one of our core businesses to make these sorts of presentations. You know, offshore wind is an up-and-coming technology, and part of our brief is to have these sorts of events. So I would ask you all to please consider joining the Australian Institute of Energy, either as an individual or as a corporate member. We have branches all around Australia, obviously the Newcastle branch, but also in many capital cities. There's the program, basically 30, 30, 30. Charlie's going to speak, then Richard's going to speak, and then 30 minutes question time. So I'll now hand over to Charlie. And if you give him welcome before you set up his presentation.
That's fine. Should I use one of these mics? You got the mic there. Unless you want to move around. Is that one? Yeah, okay. So, how's that working? No, okay, that's all right. That's forward or back, or you can use the space bar and backspace. Up to you. Great, thank you very much. Oh, great. Thanks, Richard. Well, while Luke is getting that set up, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming along today. Yeah, that's it. Yeah. And welcome to everyone on the webinar. I'm not sure where I should be looking to say welcome to you. My name is Charlie Wilson. I'm here representing the Energy Corporation of New South Wales. And I'd like to start today by thanking the Australian Institute of Energy, Ross and Nigel, for putting this event on, and also to CSIRO for hosting us. I think offshore wind, it's such an exciting topic, and it's a really timely point for us to be here having this discussion as globally this industry moves from a demonstration phase into an actual deployment phase. Myself and Richard are going to attack this from a few different directions today. So I'm going to talk a lot about the policy and legislative background for this. It's not as boring as it sounds, I promise. And Richard, for all the tech heads in the room, is going to delve into a lot more of the technical detail around this technology. There we go. So to start with, I actually want to step back
onshore and just forget about offshore for a while and talk about the background of the energy transition that we're all in at the moment. And I'm sure a lot of people in the room today are aware of this. So New South Wales currently receives about 75% of its power from coal-fired generation. Let's see if I can use this. There it is. And a lot of these plants, in particular the ones that are actually here in Lake Macquarie and in the Hunter, are scheduled to come to the end of their natural life within the next 10 years. So you can see at the very top of the graph there, we have Liddell, which is starting its closure next year. Eraring was brought forward by 7 years very recently. That's the announcement on the right there. And Bayswater's also brought forward its retirement by a couple of years. That's all the dashed lines in the graph there. So that's the challenge we have, is to actually replace 75% of the generation that we currently use to keep our lights on to power our industry here in New South Wales. The electricity infrastructure roadmap is essentially the New South Wales government's response to that challenge. And the way that the roadmap is structured is channeling huge amounts of investment. So you can see the number here, $32 billion of investment into new infrastructure to replace those coal-fired power stations. So that's a bit of a wishy-washy sentence, infrastructure. What that actually means is solar farms, wind farms, pumped hydro facilities, batteries, potentially offshore wind and high voltage transmission. So all of those things together are underneath that broader umbrella of 32 billion, which is needed to replace those coal-fired generators. And the net result of that will be to deliver reliable energy, but also to deliver cheaper energy for consumers in New South Wales. So as I said, I'm here today representing EnergyCo, and EnergyCo is the entity that was created to oversee this transition away from coal and towards renewable energy sources. And the way that we'll do that is through the renewable energy zones. I'm loving this spotlight thing. So that $32 billion is not, we're not expecting that to be invested all across the state indiscriminately. Essentially, the large majority of it will be invested in the 5 renewable energy zones, and I'll focus a little bit on them in the next few slides. So this is the most recent map of our reses. So you can see the 5 reses there, and the Illawarra at this stage is undefined from a boundary point of view. I like to think about these reses really broadly in 2 groups. So you've got the inland reses, so New England around Armidale, Central West around Dubbo, and South West, which sort of extends around Balranald and Hay, down in the Riverina. These 3 reses are really have a singular purpose. That's bulk energy generation and carrying that energy generation back to Newcastle, Wollongong, Sydney, actually where the energy is used in the state. The large majority of the energy is used in those areas. The 2 coastal reses, which is primarily what I work on at the Energy Corporation of New South Wales in the Hunter Central Coast, where we are today, and in the Illawarra, their role is a little bit more nuanced. So yes, there will be energy generation and energy storage in these areas, but we also have to consider that these 2 areas contain large energy users right now, both of them do. And in future, if we see emerging industries like hydrogen take off, it could contain much larger energy users than even exist now. And for context, the biggest energy user in the state is in the Hunter Central Coast Renewable Energy Zone at the moment. That's Tomago. So their role is a little bit more nuanced. And the other thing that's common across those 2 reses is that they're both ideal for offshore wind, which is what we're here to talk about today. So just quickly, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I just wanted to focus in on both of those reses quickly. So this map on the right here came out during our draft declaration, which happened sort of September, October this year, and we're moving towards a final declaration now by the end of the year. And And a registration of interest process that we ran in January and February of this year received 7 offshore wind submissions. So that's 7 distinct projects that are interested in developing in this region. So that illustrates, even as far back as 12 months ago, that there was already a significant amount of interest from the developer community in the Hunter to develop offshore wind projects. The Illawarra Res, as I said, the boundary is not defined at this stage, so that map is indicative. That's really just a map of the local government areas down there. That draft declaration is currently being prepared and will come out shortly. But probably the more interesting point here is that a registration of interest process, again, that we ran in mid-2022, so sort of June and July of this year, received 8 offshore wind submissions. So again, a huge amount of interest from industry, totaling 12.9 gigawatts of generation capacity. And that may just seem like a number, but that is a huge amount of potential capacity. That's enormous. That's the kind of numbers that you could use to replace coal-fired generators in one go with a few of those projects. I just missed something, I guess, on this slide. From an offshore wind perspective, you can see here that we have some indicative turbines out there. Don't read anything into where those are or how far off the coastline they are. But from a res perspective, what we did here and what we'll do in the Illawarra is try to capture where these projects might come onshore and connect to the grid. Because from our perspective, if the energy is generated 20, 30 kilometres offshore, that's great. We're really interested in where it intersects with the network and how that affects the rest of the network and whether that can power things onshore. And so we'll follow a very similar process in the Illawarra, trying to cover most of that coastline. Okay. So this slide is all about, I'm saying that the Hunter and the Illawarra are ideal for offshore wind. So this slide is really delving into why that is the case. So you can see there's a few points here. There's renewable energy zones in both regions, and I'll delve into that a little bit deeper in a moment as to why that's a beneficial thing. There's proximity to high voltage connection points. So Richard will delve a little bit more into this in his presentation, but essentially you need those high voltage connection points to connect projects of this scale. There's deep water ports here. That's really, really important when you think about the assembly of these projects, the construction of these projects and how that works. There's this goes for the Illawarra, but it's probably a bit more applicable for the Hunter. There's an existing skilled workforce here that needs to transition away from carbon intensive industries to new industries. And offshore wind is one of those things that could actually produce thousands of jobs. There is the potential there, even for a single project during construction, to produce thousands of jobs. So that's a really important point to make. And just finally, the last point there, that's circling back to what it is to be in a renewable energy zone. And I won't go into that because I don't really have enough time, but essentially renewable energy projects that connect within renewable energy zones have a number of benefits. It's easier for them to actually access the grid. There's some financial support mechanisms there and potentially some shared connection assets as well. So we know why these regions are ideal for offshore wind, but why is this good for us as a state? Why is this good for us as consumers of electricity? The top point here, I find that wording a bit hard to understand, but leveraging high capacity offshore wind resources with time diversity. So essentially, the way I would explain that is that when the wind's blowing offshore and producing power for a theoretical offshore wind plant, it's not necessarily blowing onshore, and vice versa. So they produce energy at different times. And that's really, really important when you have lots of different intermittent sources of energy. And obviously solar is part of that as well. Consumer price benefits due to greater resource diversity. Obviously, the core of any program to replace coal-fired generation is to deliver cheap energy for everybody. That's not only important for homes, but it's really important for businesses as well. If we have more diversity, we need less storage. That's basically what it comes down to. If we have energy producing at different times of the day, we don't need to overspend on a lot of storage, which is a very expensive part of the energy transition. Providing generation in proximity to electricity demand, I've really covered that. So you could be providing energy directly to very large energy consumers in the Hunter and the Illawarra. That's obviously of huge benefit if you can do that. Excuse me. Economic growth and new sources of employment, I think I've already covered that, but there's a huge potential there for the Hunter and the Illawarra. And the last point is probably one of the more interesting ones. So if we think about the role of the roadmap is to replace that generation from what we lose from coal-fired generation, we need to also consider other energy sources which are, or energy loads which are coming into the system in future. Green hydrogen is a big one. If that industry takes off, and there's been a lot of discussion about that and a lot of movement on that recently, the electricity usage across the system will increase substantially. So we actually need to source that energy from somewhere. And offshore wind could be a perfect solution to that in the sense that it delivers large amounts of energy in proximity to areas that will likely be hubs for hydrogen. This is the legislation section, so I'll try and make this as quick as possible. So the piece of legislation that will actually allow these projects to be built is called the Offshore Electricity Infrastructure Act 2021. It's a bit of a mouthful. That was passed last year, and now the federal government is in a process of identifying areas or zones in which the turbines can be constructed. So it's quite similar to the process with a renewable energy zone. You identify an area where projects can be built, and then developers can apply for licenses within that area. I guess the only other thing to say is that's a federal ministerial decision. So at the moment, that's Chris Bowen. That would be sitting under his portfolio. And there needs to be a 60-day public consultation before any declaration takes place. This is a very dense slide, so apologies for that. And it's a pretty intense flow diagram there on the left. I won't say much about this, and these slides will be sent around later, so you can delve into this if you're really into legislation and regulations. But the important part, I'll use is probably here. So essentially, when developers apply for licenses within this area, excuse me, there'll be an assessment of the technical capability, financial capability, and the suitability of a project. So projects will have to go through a competitive process, essentially, to be allocated a license. And that all sits with the federal government. So all of that process will sit with them as these turbines are installed in Commonwealth waters. Just very quickly, I wanted to touch on Victoria. So Victoria have been fairly quick out of the gates with offshore wind, and some of you might have heard about the Star of the South project. That's essentially the front runner across the country in terms of offshore wind. Victoria released this policy directions paper in March of this year. That's where the snaps come from on the right. And they set targets and they identified zones where offshore wind was likely to take place. So this has been their approach. And they've looked at some fairly large numbers, so 2 gigawatts by 2032, 4 gig by 2035, and 9 gig by 2040. So really big aspirational targets by Victoria, and looking at some of those zones. They then followed that up with probably the more interesting document, which was an implementation statement, or what they call an implementation statement, in October. So that's quite recent. And that actually took a step down in terms of detail. So they're looking at actually what does the government need to do to facilitate these projects. So they've set the big aspirational target. This implementation statement looks at the more of the nitty-gritty detail. That's why I say it's a bit more interesting. So there's a number of things there. I think the most important things are the top two. So Victoria has chosen to go with the government having a role in coordinating transmission. And when I say transmission, I mean high voltage lines coming onshore and connecting to the grid. And that can be a very difficult process, very contentious, and can have a lot of impacts on communities onshore. So that's really interesting. And the second point there is that Victoria have selected a single port. I believe it's the Port of Hastings. I'm not really across all the different ports in Victoria, but they've selected that port to support offshore wind construction. So essentially that will have dedicated areas for the assembly of these projects, which is quite interesting. So I think to give my voice a bit of a break, I'm going to play a video now. Actually, before I do that, I might make one more comment about Victoria. So it's really important to make a distinction at this point between Victoria and New South Wales. Victoria is likely to have mostly fixed bottom offshore wind turbines. That means they're literally fixed into the seabed at relatively shallow water depths. That kind of technology is pretty well proven worldwide and has been rolled out in the North Sea and other areas in Europe fairly extensively. Unfortunately, in New South Wales, due to the water depths here, it's unlikely we'll be able to actually pursue that technology. Our water table drops off quite quickly, which means that if you don't want to have turbines very, very close to shore, we'll need to utilise floating offshore wind technology. So although Victoria has their approach with offshore wind, it has to be noted that they're very different propositions, floating offshore wind and fixed bottom offshore wind, which will be important for this video. Let's see if this works. But essentially, this is a video of an offshore wind installation in Europe. There's not a huge amount of operational floating offshore wind projects out there, and this is one. And I think this video, and Richard's got a few videos as well, just shows you the scale of these projects. Remember that this is a few turbines, but a single project here in Newcastle could have 50, 100, even more turbines. So just think about the multiplying effect there. I might turn the music down because it's a bit... skip past all this.
This is a new way of generating energy and an important step to fight against climate change. Portugal enters in a new era with an international acclaimed solution in the production of offshore renewable energy. The Windfloat Atlantic project, formed by Ocean Winds, Repsol and Principal Power, is the first floating wind farm in continental Europe just off the coast of Viana do Castelo. This floating wind farm will allow the optimization of natural resources and will speed up the commercial deployment of this innovative technology. Windfloat Atlantic is an example of a more sustainable future for mankind, with the largest turbines ever installed on floating platforms. The total installed capacity of 25 megawatts will provide sufficient energy to 60,000 people throughout the year. This energy promises an endless source. The potential of wind is immense, and this renewable energy is an essential part of the worldwide decarbonization strategy, free of CO2 emissions. The Windfloat Atlantic project is the future we envision. our mission has begun, and we will continue to nurture the power of nature to make our planet more sustainable. This is the beginning of a new era committed to enabling a better future. Windfloat Atlantic. Energy beyond the horizon.
Pause it there. And I apologize for the aspirational music in that video. It's a bit cheesy, isn't it? Oops. There we go. So just to stay on that theme of floating versus fixed for a moment, as I mentioned, the fixed offshore wind industry is fairly well established worldwide. The technology's there, the skills are there. There's a lot of very large operational projects that are already out there. Floating offshore wind, and that's what you just saw in that video with the platforms literally floating out at sea, is a little bit earlier in its development as an industry. So we're kind of at that stage where we have a handful of smaller operational projects at the moment, but there have been targets and auctions for floating offshore wind around the world. So we're seeing this ramp up very, very quickly, and New South Wales will be a part of that. So you can see there's a few countries up here. The UK have set a target specifically for floating. Ireland again has identified particular sites and set a goal, and France has tendered specifically for floating wind capacity. And you can see the numbers there are starting to get into the gigawatt scale, which is what we saw in our registrations of interest for the Hunter and the Illawarra. So this industry, while it's at the moment, it's still in its infancy, has the potential to really ramp up massively, and for those economies of scale to kick in and to bring all the benefits that come with it. So you saw the scale of those installations in that video, and I really like this image because it kind of again brings that home. You can see there's a little person down here, and there's a car back there, which just gives you an idea. I mean, if this was sitting on the port of Newcastle, for example, you can imagine how big that is. And this is one platform. You know, just indicatively, it's hard to tell at the moment because turbine sizes are constantly changing, but a 1 gigawatt project, for example, would consist of over 50 of these platforms. So that's just the platform. Then you obviously have the tower, the nacelle, the blades, the mooring system. There's a lot of things that go into that. So as an infrastructure project, these things are huge in scale, and that's why the potential for employment and other supporting industries around that is really huge, and also why ports are a really key part of the picture. Supply chain is something that people talk about a lot with offshore wind, and that's obvious when you look at, you know, when you just look at that piece of infrastructure. There's obviously a lot of things that go into that, you know, steel and concrete and various other things. But there's also lots of other things. There's the array cables that actually carry the electricity. There's potentially offshore substations, mooring systems, and all the vessels that go into construction and maintenance. There's so many opportunities there for the Hunter, if even one of these projects manages to get constructed, for lots of jobs that go around the project as well as directly for the project. Cost is always something that people bring up for offshore wind, and I know Richard's going to cover this as well. Obviously, as I mentioned, when you're talking about energy, always the first objective is reliability and affordability. That has to be the main things that you look at. So although all this renewable energy is sustainable as well, the most important things are reliability and affordability. Levelized cost of electricity is a bit of a metric that is used in the energy industry to look at the cost of energy over the life of a project, essentially. And you can see here, as I was talking about, there's that difference between fixed bottom and floating. So you can see that the blue is fixed bottom, and you can see if we go back to 2015 there, going down to, we're sort of sitting at around there, I guess now. There's been a huge drop-off in the cost of those projects, and that's because the industry globally has just scaled up massively, and that brings with it economies of scale and much cheaper prices. We have a smaller data set for floating projects, obviously, but we can look ahead to some of those auctions that are happening right now and look at the prices that are being set through those auctions, and that's where that green line is sitting at the moment. So that's the floating offshore wind line. So obviously, if this industry scales up globally, we'll see a similar curve trajectory to what we see there with fixed bottom offshore wind, which would allow it to become competitive with onshore renewables, among other things, and deliver that affordable energy for New South Wales consumers and businesses. Hydrogen is obviously something people talk about a lot, and I see a lot of parallels between hydrogen and offshore wind. They're both emerging industries. There's both not a lot of actual operational projects in Australia to go and look at and to see how they work in practice. But the Hunter and the Illawarra have both been selected as hydrogen hubs by the New South Wales State Government through the hydrogen strategy. And you can see here, these are the shortlisted projects for funding through the Hydrogen Hubs program. And you can see where they're clustered. They're clustered around the port, essentially, and down around Port Kembla in the Illawarra. So there's a lot of alignment between renewable energy zones, offshore wind, and green hydrogen. And there's a lot of complementary aspects to hydrogen and offshore wind. Hydrogen, if it takes off at scale, will be a huge consumer of energy. Offshore wind will be a huge producer of energy, and they're both essentially in the same location. It's pretty simple, really. Those two industries could fuel one another going into the 2030s. There is the potential for that. I think this is my last slide. So this is tying it all back to EnergyCo and what's our response to the development of an offshore wind industry. If we go back a couple of years ago, offshore wind wasn't really in the thoughts of policymakers in New South Wales. It was more about onshore, and that was the accepted technology, and that was the safe bet, and that's what people went with. What we've seen over the past 6 to 12 months is a big change of tack, and that's been driven by a lot of interest coming to us through those registrations of interest and other approaches, and a knowledge that globally this floating offshore wind market is taking off. So it's a really good moment for New South Wales to take advantage of that. So EnergyCo, that's who I work for, we've been engaging pretty closely with the federal government around those potential areas in the Hunter and the Illawarra. That's been probably our most important role to date. We've engaged a consultant to conduct research on the opportunities and challenges. That's obviously very broad language, but it's just looking at how would offshore wind work here and what are the things that we need to consider as a government. And we've also engaged with a number of state government agencies on what do we need to consider for an offshore wind industry in New South Wales. There's obviously a lot of things that we need to look at, whether it's visual impact for turbines being, near the coastline, or migratory birds, or native tidal. Or there's a lot of different things that we need to consider, which we are in the process of kind of collating that information at the moment. And I believe that's my last slide. So thank you very much.
Very much, Charlie. Let's see if we can How do we kill this? So it's been brought to my attention that I failed to adequately introduce Charlie. So as you can see on the screen, he's a fairly accomplished gentleman. He's like a senior policy and project officer at EnergyCo, and he's a fairly important person in this process and in the Hunter and Central Coast reses. So I won't read that for you, but you can get an idea. This is who Charlie is. He's quite the person, and we thank you very, very much. So we're very lucky to have him speaking with us today. So the next person we're going to be hearing from is Richard Finlay-Jones. And as Richard, he points it out self-deprecatingly, he's a veteran. He's a veteran of the wind industry, and he's well known around Newcastle, and a wonderful person. And we're very pleased to have Richard with us today. He's been working in the wind industry since the year 2000, I believe, and he is on the board of Newcastle Offshore Wind, which has a wonderful proposal. We're about to hear from him very soon as we set up the slides for him. So would you please welcome Richard Finlay-Jones.
I should see if I could work the technology first. Those people who are on the webinar, can you hear this? Are there any thumbs up? Yep.
Yeah.
G'day, Fifi. Thanks, mate. So just by way of introduction, I'd really like to thank the Institute of Energy. I'm a fellow of the Institute. Nigel didn't know that. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today. Thank you also to CSIRO and for the use of the facilities, and congratulations on the CSIRO report that just came out yesterday, which was fantastic but frightening, the impacts of climate change. Have a look at that if you're doing your homework. I'll just see if I can make this work. Yep. So I'm part of the Newcastle Offshore Wind team. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners, the Warramai and the Awabakal people. Thanks again to the Institute, and thanks CSIRO, and thanks everybody for coming along today to listen to this. We've actually been flying under the radar a bit compared to some of the other developers. That's been deliberate. That's because we're broke. We don't have any money, but we're hopefully going to change that situation fairly swiftly. But yeah, I wanted to give you an introduction to a bit of wind energy, talk a little bit about onshore. We'll do a bit of Wind 101, and then we'll move into the offshore, some of the trends that have been happening overseas, and then have a look at the floating offshore opportunities. Look at offshore wind in Australia, because there's a lot of offshore wind that's proposed for our country, and then look at New South Wales. We'll drill down, and then I can do my pitch on our little project. How does that sound? So, Wind 101, parts of the wind turbine. Let me see if I can work Charlie's fantastic duva. There we go. So, that's a blade. The 3 blades make up the rotor. The generation part of the turbine is called the nacelle. That houses the gearbox and all the machinery. That little part there is called the hub. That's the tower. And the power runs from, well, I think the next slide describes how a wind turbine works. The blades catch the wind and they turn. The generator converts mechanical energy into electricity. The electricity, there's an induction generator in there, or a permanent drive magnet that drives the power down. At the bottom of the turbine, there's either a kiosk inverter or a transformer that converts it from relatively low voltage to high voltage, usually 33 or 66 kV. And then it goes, for onshore wind, it goes underground, and there are strings of turbines connected to collector stations. The collector stations then goes to a substation. The substation then connects to the grid, usually. Hope that makes sense. So bigger is better. As you saw from Charlie's slide, the turbines are getting bigger, the blades are getting bigger. The generation capacity is getting bigger. I'm old enough to remember when 1 megawatt was a big turbine. And that little diagram there shows you the reason why. So what it's saying there is that, I think it's pretty self-explanatory, is that a 25-metre blade there, in that part of the world, that 25-metre blade is creating that much energy. A double the blade is creating that much energy. So it's not just double. And that's a similar slide to the one Charlie showed, which shows the evolution of turbines back in the 80s, back in the day. That size there was the size of our Kooragang wind turbine that we used to have. Sorry, I'm not holding that well at all. That size there. And we're now looking at 6 megawatt, 7 megawatt platforms for onshore wind currently. And this is the future. This is what we're looking at now. 20 megawatt turbines. And there's already a project in Portugal that's looking at 20 megawatt floating foundations. We'll get to that. This is a pretty old graph. You can see it's 2018. It shows it's focusing on the EU. There's a China figure there, but that's the one I wanted to really focus on there. That China figure there. But this shows the growth of, this is the global installed wind capacity. So that's onshore and offshore combined for all those countries. I think you can see the growth in the wind industry. And then if we go to the next slide, this shows what's happening in offshore wind. So here you have on the y-axis the cumulative installed onshore capacity in gigawatts, and that's 2010 going up to 2019, and that's broken up into countries again. What's interesting about these slides is that there's no mention of China. You can see the second graph is the cumulative installed offshore wind capacity, and most of that would be bottom fixed. So this is a slide that I just grabbed off the net from the Global Wind Energy Council, who collate all the statistics and data from the Global Wind Energy source. And so what that's showing is the gradual rise in offshore wind over time from 2017 going up to 2021. The green is is onshore, and the blue little section up the top there is offshore. And this graph here is showing new wind power capacity in 2021 by region. So you can see that APAC is 59% of the new wind power capacity in 2021. And the top 5 markets in 2021 is that third graph in the corner, and 51% of that is the People's Republic of China. So China has installed more wind energy than all the other countries combined in the last year. So why offshore wind? I think Charlie sort of alluded to this, but you can see in this graphical depiction that the wind speeds are better. The wind speeds are better. That's the first thing that's driving us to get to there. If I put that there, so this gets a level of 4 out of 5, and onshore winds only gets a level of 3 out of 5. This is only like a graphical depiction, but generally the wind speeds offshore are better. Further out you go, the better the wind speeds, typically. The locations for offshore are more limited, but they're bigger. The locations for onshore, you know, I'd query this now. There is no such thing as an easy wind project, is what I've learned over the last 20 years onshore. Doesn't matter what size, there's no such thing as an easy wind project. Obviously the dimensions and the scale of offshore wind can be much greater, much larger, and the community impact is lower. Social impact of wind energy is the most difficult part of any wind energy project in Australia at the moment. Social licence to operate is extremely difficult, and it's getting harder every day. So offshore is getting more attractive to developers like me. So let's have a look at these offshore wind foundations. As Charlie mentioned, the monopile is now market standard. So that's a single pole that's driven into the seabed, and that's usually at a depth of 0 to 30 metres. The jacket or tripod allows for greater depth, so you can move out into the ocean a little further. It's still fixed bottom, but it's more expensive. And then you move into the floating structures, which is the tension leg platform, the TLP, the semi-submersible, and the spar. And they're all floating devices. The TLP is almost like a fixed structure. So it has tendons that go down to the ocean floor here. And typically what they have here is vacuum anchors. So they suck up the dirt and hold those tension cables very tight. Whereas with your semi-submersible and your spar, they tend to be anchored. So they're loose and they're anchored, but they keep the structure as stable as possible for what they do. I hope that's clear. And you can see that the depth you can get to with the floating structures can be in excess of 120 metres. I've just learned that they can go down to a depth of 2K, but then obviously there's a cost consideration there with the cables and the anchors. By the way, in Charlie's video that you saw, the big yellow things, the great big yellow things, they're the anchors. They're the anchors that go on the end of the mooring cables. They're about 300 tonnes each. Here's a little case study that I don't expect you to read that, but the essential is that in the EU and all around the world now, they are looking at purpose-developed ports for the construction of offshore and particularly floating offshore wind foundations and turbine manufacture. So the ideal situation for us, I believe, would be an integrated manufacturing facility for the Port of Newcastle, where we have a supply chain that builds the foundation components, and then as it's walking along the port, if you like, the turbine gets placed on it. So it starts off on land, the floating foundation moves into the port, into the ocean, and then you build the turbine on top of that, and then it gets floated out as a single unit. And that's what's happening in other parts of the world. So just getting back to those different types of floating foundations. This one shows the barge, which is just essentially a platform, the semi-submersible, the articulated multi-spar, which is a bit of a combination of the semi-submersible and the spar. So the spar is the vertical one. And if you'd have a look at the size, Charlie was talking about how big the semi-submersible is. Well, the articulated multi-spar has legs that fold. So the bottom of that can fold up. So when you're floating it out, they're folded, and then when you take it out to the depth, they drop down again. So then you can cable it down. The spar can be floated out sideways unless you're putting the turbine on it. So the limitations of these reflect usually the port capacity. So if you've got a limited draft in the port, you can't have a very long draft of the floating foundation. And the last one is the tension leg platform that we talked about before. I don't think we need to show this after Charlie's great video, so thanks Charlie for that. Got me off the hook. So Charlie was talking about, the floating offshore winds proposals that are out there. This is a bit dated, so some of these have actually gone ahead. The High Wind Scotland project is actually working now. The Windfloat Atlantic project was the one that Charlie showed on the video. A lot of these other ones are proposed, and the High Wind Tampen project down the bottom in Norway has already commenced. They've got the first few turbines that are out there in the ocean now, and as of a few weeks ago, they're actually supplying power to gas and oil plants out in the North Sea. The residual of those, Kincardine. The Kincardine one has also started. It's gone ahead, but the others are all proposed. So there's a really strong pipeline of potentially pilot projects. But behind that, you saw from Charlie's graph the commitments to offshore wind from all the countries around the world because of what we were talking about, because of the large areas of ocean, because of the good wind resource, because of the ability to do things at scale and drag the power back to the land. They're the drivers of this. And I was reading an article in the last few days that said even if we install all of the offshore wind that is proposed with all the targets, we still won't meet our climate objectives. Unfortunately, we still won't meet what we need to do. So we've got to work a lot harder, people. Here's a case study of the High Wind Scotland project. And we were talking about scale before. Each blade of the turbines is similar in length to an Airbus A380 wingspan. That's 80 metres. The expectation is that these blades will get to 100 metres. GE already has a two-piece blade that, for onshore wind. It's probably not going to be necessary for offshore wind, but we have a representative from CWP who they've just installed the Bango wind project down Yass Way, and that has two-part blades. It's the first two-part blade project in Australia. Congratulations, Egan. So this is talking about 800 metres depth for these turbines and electricity to 20,000 homes, reducing the carbon emissions by 63,000 tonnes. And it's 25 k's off the coast of Scotland, which is about the same distance that we're talking about for Newcastle. So there's a little bit more about the High Wind project. It's not too dissimilar to the Portuguese project that Charlie was talking about. It has an installed capacity of 30 meg. The water depth there is up to 120 metres. It's a spar type substructure, so it's that single pontoon, and it has ballast in there to hold it down. It's similar to what you would use on a yacht to stop the yacht yawing. 30k export cable back to the land. This is interesting. This shows how the mooring might work. So the numbers there show the turbines. Sorry. So each of those is a turbine. This is an aerial view. These are the moorings. So you have 3 mooring lines with the anchors. These are the anchors here. These are the electrical lines combining the turbine. So the electricity runs like that. And then what they're toying with now is having the anchor, these, shared. To reduce the cost, have shared anchors across the array. And that will drive the price down. But what it might mean is bigger anchors. So there's a cost benefit that might happen. And once again, that shows the size of the turbines. They're only getting bigger. A bit of a discussion about Kincardine there. You can read about this a bit later on. There's another shot of the semi-submersible. So this is interesting. This is a wind float. This is a piece of wind float technology, which is proprietary information. It has permanent water ballast to lower the platform. So as it fills up with water, it sinks. Has a smart hull trim system, which moves the water from the column to compensate for mean turbine thrust load. So if you think about an offshore wind turbine, it's got the worst of everything. So you've got your turbine sitting there, the wind striking the turbine, forcing the load this way. You've got your foundation saying, no, we want you to push you that way. You've got the ability for the turbine to nod its head to yaw towards the wind. And at the same time, you've got the ballast in the foundations trying to juggle all these forces. On top of that, you have a swell, potentially, and you may also have a current underneath. So you have all of these forces that the wind industry is not experienced with, but the gas and oil industry is. So we're bringing these two pieces of technology together, not in the way they were necessarily designed to do. We designed wind turbines to be sitting on the land, not to be sitting on some rocky barge. So there's a whole lot of technology happening and controllers, and even the cables now have dynamic flexes in them and floats to reduce the amount of bend and reduce the amount of drag and improve the ability for that whole system to remain stable, which I think is really exciting, because I'm a mad surfer and I just don't know how they do this. It's crazy. It's fantastic. But there's a lot of proprietary information in this, and all the smarties are now looking at how they keep the floating foundation as stable as possible in the worst possible conditions, like the storms in the North Sea. I reckon it's wonderful. I'm not going to play that one either, because you reckon? So here's a forecast of the floating offshore wind projects around the world. You can see there that there are lots of targets for floating offshore wind, and ours is not insignificant. Ours is a pretty strong target forecast, and that relates back to what Charlie was saying. There are 7 projects proposed off the coast of Newcastle. Our project in itself could be up to 10 gigawatts, which would power most of the capacity that we have in the grid at the moment. But look at those targets. So even though this stuff is expensive, even though this stuff is difficult, everyone's committing to it. And I think that's really exciting. We were talking about levelized cost of electricity or levelized cost of energy, LCOE forecasts. And here's a graph that's showing the forecasts of the price of wind, onshore, fixed bottom offshore and floating offshore, and how they're going to fall. It's a little bit difficult to read at first, but what you've got to understand is what's happening here is we're looking at the reduction in the baseline cost as of 2014. So that, so that line there, gonna get to work now? Absolutely, that one. So that's your baseline for onshore, that's the baseline for offshore, and that's the baseline for floating offshore. And bear in mind, they're not level. So they're different. They look like they're level there, but what we're looking at is the drop that's forecast in all those prices. At the moment, Charlie showed a graph that bottom fixed offshore will meet onshore pretty soon. I'm old enough to remember when solar was more expensive than wind. And we watched the LCOE of solar come down to meet onshore wind. Now we're watching the LCOE of offshore wind, bottom fixed, meeting the LCOE of onshore wind. And it's only going to take a little bit longer for floating offshore to meet the LCOE of all of them. 2050. Maybe sooner. So that's not dissimilar to the graph that Charlie showed. The levelized cost of energy, the comparison of bottom fixed and floating, and the total investment cost. So we're still sitting at the moment, it's about double. Depending on the project, depending on where it is, depending on the ocean depth, it's still about double, if not more. And there's lots to do. But there's plenty of drivers for us to do this. It's very exciting. Here's a little map showing where the target offshore wind project locations are proposed for Australia. And you can see it's mostly around the south. The best winds are obviously in the roaring 40s down Tasmania and southern Victoria. We all know where the good winds are, but that's not necessarily where the loads are. We've already talked about the grid capacity in this part of the world. We've got one of the strongest parts of the grid in Australia, which is fantastic for the projects we're looking at. Yeah, so there's projects proposed for all around Australia. Charlie mentioned that the majority of the projects in New South Wales will need to be floating because of the continental shelf being so far out. We don't want to see these things. I can tell you a story. It won't take too long. We had a turbine here in Newcastle called the Kooragang turbine. It was a 700 kilowatt turbine, and it was a fantastic little turbine because it stopped everyone in Newcastle being frightened of wind. It was such a great little turbine. You could drive past it, you could stand under it. You weren't going to grow another head. It wasn't going to stop your sheep from producing wool. It wasn't going to stop your cows from producing. It was not going to stop your chooks from from laying eggs. Don't worry, I've heard them all. But it went away, and we've got two representative clean aids here, the Clean Energy Association of Newcastle and Surrounds. This is our local community renewable energy group, and they tried to buy that turbine unsuccessfully, but had a good crack, and we're going to keep it in Newcastle. Unfortunately, they failed. They were outbid by a Tasmanian chook farmer who managed to take that turbine down to Tasmania and help generate power for his other two turbines that he already had on site. He knew a bargain when he saw it, and he got that bargain and he took it. But now we know we didn't have anything. So someone said, why don't we place a big turbine out in the middle of the harbour to replace that one? And then somebody else said, why don't we put a whole bunch out there? And then those people spoke to Siemens Gamesa and said, why don't we put 8 4 megawatts turbines off the north breakwater at Stockton? And why don't we connect it into the port? Well, there's a number of reasons why that didn't happen. Stockton Beach is an emergency landing area for light aircraft. The Newcastle pilot is required to fly over Nobbies, so that wasn't a good spot for it. Department of Defence said that it would mess with their radar navigation, so that was out. And most importantly, people didn't want to see it. People did not want to see these turbines. So what do? Send them out to sea. Where do we put them? Way out. What do? We have to have lots of them, because in order to put them all the way out there, we need to pay for it. So to pay for it, we need scale, they need to be big, and there needs to be lots of them, and they need to be manufactured here. Otherwise, it's going to be too costly. So there's all the people we spoke to, and that's what we learned. So now we're looking at a project that could be up to 10 gigawatts. And remember, we're only one of 7 proponents that Charlie spoke of. And my guess is that when the feds do release this legislation, there's going to be a bucket load more than 7 proponents. They're going to come out of the woodwork. I want you to know that this project is a local project by local people, and have been doing this for a long time, and have worked really hard to get to where we are with very little resources. So the area that we're looking at is over 2,000 kilometres squared. It's going to have to be a staged development, because you can't build gigawatts in one fell swoop. It takes time. They'll be floating because we're out past the continental shelf, we're out past these shipping lanes. And we'll have offshore substations which will connect back to the shore. And as Charlie mentioned, the goal is to potentially have this powering hydrogen facilities so that we can replace our coal exports with another energy export called hydrogen. The other benefit of hydrogen is we can use that hydrogen for local grid stability, and we can use it for local loads. There's an existing gas market, and even though hydrogen has only recently kind of become sexy, there's been an old hydrogen market for many, many years. So I think we've been through most of that. What we did is we jumped in a helicopter and went out to the site and looked back. So that's a helicopter. It was a howling nor'easter, as you can probably tell. We looked back, and that's what you could see. So it's possible that on a clear day you would be able to see the tips of the rotors. On a hazy day, you're not going to see this thing. You're not going to see any turbines. On a cloudy day, on a rainy day, you're not going to see it. But on a clear day, you will probably see the tips of the rotors. Depending on how high you are, the higher up you go, the more you'll see. We talked about transmission connection options. Now, this is intellectual property. So I'm not going to delve into the depths of this, because this is the smarts around how we make this work. You've got to pick the best spot on the grid to send the power back in. So that's just a big map of the transgrid system. So to talk about the yields and the greenhouse gas offsets, we're talking about 43 terawatt hours, net capacity factor of 41% based on the wind speed, 35.6 million tonnes per annum of greenhouse gases displaced, 5.5 million equivalent households powered, 17.3 million cars removed, or 6.1 million trees planted per annum. There's the wind data. This is high level, and this is from not on-site wind collection. This is from desktop available data. And what it shows is that at its worst, it's in the high 7 metres per second. Now, if I saw a project 20 years ago that was in an onshore wind project that was in the high 7s, close to 8, I would be overjoyed. Overjoyed. And the other thing it shows is that it's quite consistent. The second graph shows the long-term wind speeds for that part of the world. So it's very consistent. That's the great thing about offshore wind. It's usually stronger, it's usually more consistent, and it usually has great laminar flow, which is what we're looking for. So there's that photo of that facility again, and I'd like to talk just about some of the benefits that this sort of a project and the other projects that are proposed could bring. It's a coal replacement transition strategy. It's complementary to the other generation that's happening around New South Wales. We can utilise the existing transmission infrastructure. So there's a little bit of upgrading we would need to do, and obviously there's new submarine cables that would need to be brought on, but the majority of the infrastructure is there. We have strong local loads. Tomago has been mentioned, but there's other steel production. There's the opportunity, and Sam Mellor's in the audience, for green steel production. So this is really exciting. We could be a steel town again. Imagine that. Wouldn't that be fantastic? And there's other significant loads that are proposed. So the Port of Newcastle is well located for this sort of a project. Our capital investment, we estimate at 25 billion. It's expected to bring 14 billion in domestic economic output and could be up to 3,000 new jobs. A bit more about hydrogen. The status of our project is it's very, very early stages. Even though there's a lot of ticks in this graph, we're still at the very early stage. We've still got lots to do. The lead time on a project like this to take it to financial close is in the order of 5 to 7 years. And that's fast. I've been working on onshore wind projects that have been in the process for 20 years and still haven't gotten up. I've seen others get up more quickly. The fastest solar project I ever saw get up was in 3 years. 3 years from first contact with the land to financial close. So these projects take a long time and they're extremely expensive. I don't think there'll be too much change out of $200 million just to take it to financial close. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Richard.